Okay, this is an equation. 1/2 of x minus 3/4 equals 5/8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to solve this using both methods. Now, method one is get rid of the constant first, then the coefficient. It's what you did in grade 7 and 8. So in order to get rid of the minus 3/4, I'm going to add 3/4 to create an opposite operation. But over here, I'm also going to add 3/4 to that side. I'm going to have a 1/2 of x is equal to, make sure you find your common denominators of 8. 5/8 plus 6/8 is 11/8. Now you could change that to 1 and 3/8 if you wanted right now, but I know that it's always easier to work with improper fractions until the end. So I'm going to keep it 11/8. I'm not going to change it to mixed yet. Only at the end will I change it to mixed. Now I have a coefficient of 1/2, which means I'm multiplying x by a half. So the opposite operation is to divide by a half, which is the opposite operation. Leave me with x. When I divide this side by half, I know that I can get the same answer by keeping the first fraction and multiplying by the reciprocal. Obviously, I can multiply 11 by 2 to get 22 and 8 by 1 to get 8. Or 2 over 8 is, in lowest terms, 1 over 4. Not 4 over 1, but 1 over 4. Which means I get a final answer of 11 over 4. Or if you had 22 over 8, that's fine. Which is going to reduce down to lowest terms as being 2 and 3/4. So using that method, all of the basic stuff you learned in grade 7 and 8, constant first, coefficient second, works for these questions. But a different way we could have tackled it is by method 2, which is multiplying both sides by a common multiple. Now, even though I don't need to write it, if I asked you what is the first multiple that 2, 4, and 8 share, you could physically write out all of the multiples of 2, all of the multiples of 4, and all of the multiples of 8, and you would realize that the first one they share is 8. And if you realize that 8 is the first multiple, or any multiple, it doesn't have to be the lowest, just the lowest common multiple makes it easier, I could multiply both of these sides by 8, keeping this idea of whatever I do to one side of an equation. So if I multiply this side by 8 and this side by 8, I will maintain equality. But before I do that, I want to change this, don't I? What do I want to change a half x to? Just to make it simpler and easier to see. X over 2. Because this is still half of x. So before I go ahead and multiply both sides by 8, I'm going to rewrite my coefficient if it's fractional to be a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to write it as x over 2. And you're going to see why in a second. Because when I multiply this side by 8, because it's a binomial, going back to your terms from chapter 5 or 7, 5 and 7, because it's a binomial, if I'm going to multiply this side by 8, I have to multiply both terms by 8. If it's a side, not a term by 8, but a side by 8 means all the terms need to be multiplied by 8. And over here, I have to multiply that monomial by 8, and I'm just going to express it like that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this as being 8 over 1 multiplied by x over 2. And I'm going to write it as 8 over 1 multiplied by a negative 3 over 4. Now notice, this negative sign, I'm going to just leave with the numerator. It's going to help you here in a second. So when I do this one, 8 over 1 multiplied by x over 2 is going to be 4x. Now if you didn't cross reduce, you got 8x over 2, which is still 4x. And 8 over 1 times 4 is going to be a negative 6. Now notice, because I brought my negative sign there, it allows me to see this as subtraction, right? So it's 4x minus 6 is equal to, cross reduce, I'm going to get 1 over 1, which is going to be 5. So by multiplying both sides of an equation by a common multiple of all the denominators, I make a simpler equation that in this case is 8 times bigger on both sides. But because it's 8 times bigger on both sides, there are no fractions anymore. Okay? Because every term is 8 times bigger than it was. It's still equal, which means I can isolate the variable for this, and it's much easier because I have no fractions to work with. I can add 6 to both sides. I can get 4x equals 11. I can divide both sides now by 4. And x will equal 11/4, which is equal to 2 3/4.